All right, guys, so this video is take two. I got a phone call in the middle of the last YouTube connection, and so it cut the video off. Not that you care, but it seems a little fragmented, the lesson does, so give me a minute to kind of get back in the swing of it. So I think if I remember correctly that I just gone through like the baseball analogy of the cause and effect relationship. So that takes us to a part of our story that we did on test day. So I'd like you, if you don't mind, I'm going to have a seat. If you will go ahead and take your book out to, I think it is page 142. And I'm going to reread a section. Excuse me while I try to get comfortable here. I'm going to reread a section, and we want to keep the cause and effect portion in mind. So 142, and I want you to find the word insane. It just kind of stands out by itself. And I'm going to start the paragraph below that. He started to move ever so slowly. Her head turned and her back hair went up, like the hair on an angry dog. And he stopped, took a slow breath, and the hair went down, and she ate. Move, hair up, stop, hair down, move, hair up, a half foot at a time until he was at the edge of the water. He stayed on his hands and knees, indeed, was hurt, so he wasn't sure he could walk away. And she seemed to accept that and let him crawl slowly and out of the water and up into the trees and brush. When he was behind a tree, he stood carefully and took stock. Legs seemed all right, but his ribs were hurt bad. He could only take short breaths, and then he had a jabbing pain, and his right shoulder seemed to be wrenched somehow. Also, his bow and spear and fool bird were in the water. At least he could walk, and he had just about decided to leave everything when the cow moved out of the deeper water and left him. And as quickly as she'd come, walking down along the shoreline in the shallow water, with her long legs making sucking sounds when she pulled them free of the mud, hanging on a pine limb, he watched her go, half expecting her to turn and come back to run him over again. But she kept going. And when she was well gone from sight, he went to the bank and found the bird, then waited out a bit to get his bow and spear. Neither of them was broken, and the arrows, incredibly, were still on his belt in the pouch, although messed up with mud and water. It took him most of an hour to work his way back around the lake. His legs worked well enough, but if he took 2 or 3 steps, fast steps, he would begin to breathe deeply, and the pain from his ribs would stop him, and he would have to lean against a tree until he could slow back down to shallow breathing. She had done more damage than he had originally thought, the insane cow. No sense at all to it, just madness. When he got to the shelter, he crawled inside and was grateful that the coals were still glowing and that he had thought to get wood first thing in the morning to be ready for the day. Grateful that he had thought to get enough wood for 2 or 3 days at a time. Grateful that he had fish nearby if he needed to eat. Grateful, finally, as he dozed off, that he was alive. So insane, he thought, letting sleep cover the pain in his chest. Such an insane attack for no reason, and he fell asleep with his mind trying to make the moose have reason. So, if we think about this particular reading with the moose attack, so the cause is the moose attack. So what are some of the effects on Brian from this particular attack? And so if you think about it, one effect was that his ribs are damaged and hurt. And we know that by, if we count up on page 142 to at the bottom of the page, the last full paragraph, it says, but his ribs were hurt bad. He could only take short breaths. And then he had a jabbing pain. So one effect of the moose attack is those hurt ribs. In that same paragraph, though, it also talks about a second effect of the moose attack. And that is that he had damaged his shoulder. He called it wrenched his shoulder. So cause and effect relationship. Now, when I think about my end in mind, and they're wanting us to think about settings and situations here, if I think about the setting, you know, he's at a pond, and the cause of that he's at the pond is the plane wreck. The effect is that he's at a pond and when this transpired. So the cause is the plane wreck. The effect is he's at a pond in the Canadian wilderness. The situation, if we think about cause and effect, is that the cause, there's a plane wreck, which caused the effect then being that he's at a pond where there is a moose and that has taken to attack him. So when we think about cause and effect relationships for this particular end in mind, we really have to think about all three of these things together. The last one of these that we're going to think about is a character trait of Brian at this point. He is still showing that character trait of perseverance. Even though he's hurt, even though his ribs are damaged and his shoulder is wrenched, he doesn't just lay there and go, oh God, I'm dying. Oh, poor woe is me. No, he gets up, and even though it takes him an extreme amount of time, he makes it back to his shelter. He doesn't give up. This particular lesson, like I said before, is multifaceted. So there are many different ways to look at cause and effect within this particular end in mind. So that's where we are. Now we're going to start new reading for today. I'd like you to go to 144. And I'll be honest, it is quite a few pages, so just kind of get yourself comfy and let's go. The noise awakened him. It was a low sound, a low roaring sound that came from wind. And his eyes snapped open, not because it was loud, but because it was new. He had felt wind in his shelter, felt the rain that came with wind, and had heard thunder many times in the past 47 days, but not this noise. Low, almost alive, almost from a throat somehow. The sound, the noise was a roar, a far-off roar, but coming at him, and when he was fully awake, he sat up in the darkness, grimacing with pain from his ribs. The pain was different now, a tightened pain, and I lost myself. And it seemed less, but the sound, so strange, he thought, a mystery sound, a spirit sound, a bad sound. And he took some small wood and got the fire going again and felt some little comfort and cheer from the flames, but also felt that he should get ready. He did not know how, but he should get ready. The sound was coming for him, just for him, and he had to get ready. The sound wanted him. He found the spear and bow where they were hanging on the peg of the shelter wall and brought his weapons to the bed he had made of pine boughs. More comfort, but like the comfort of the flames, it didn't work with this new threat, and he didn't understand yet. Restless threat, he thought, and stood out of the shelter away from the flames to study the sky, but it was too dark. The sound meant something to him, something from his memory, something he had read about, something he had seen on television, something. Oh, he thought, oh no. It was wind like the sound of a train with the low belly roar of a train. It was a tornado. That was it. The roar of a train meant bad wind, and it was coming for him. God, he thought, on top of the moose, not this, not this. But it was too late. Too late to do anything. In the strange stillness, he looked to the night sky and then turned back into his shelter and was leaning over to go through the door opening when it hit. Later, he could think of it and find that it was the same as the moose, just insanity. He was taken in the back by some mad force and driven into the shelter on his face, slammed down into the pine branches of his tree, or the pine branches of his bed, excuse me. At the same time, the wind tore at the fire and sprayed red coals and sparks in a cloud around him. Then it backed out, seemed to hesitate momentarily, and returned with a massive roar. A roar that took his ears and mind and body. He was whipped against the front wall of the shelter like a rag, and he felt a ripping pain in his ribs again, then was hammered back down into the sand once more, while the wind took the whole wall, his bed, the fire, his tools, all of it, and threw it out into the lake, gone out of sight, gone forever. He felt a burning on his neck and reached up to find red coals there, and he brushed them off. Found more in his pants and brushed them away. And the wind hit again. Heavy gust, tearing gust. He heard trees snapping in the forest around the rock, felt his body slipping out and clawed at the rocks to hold himself down. He couldn't think. He just held and knew that he was praying, but didn't know what the prayer was. Knew that he wanted to be, stay and be, and then the wind moved to the lake. Brian heard the great roaring, sucking sounds of the water and opened his eyes to see the lake torn by the wind, the water slamming in great waves that went in all ways, fought each other, and then rose in a spout of water going up into the night sky like a wet column of light. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time. Well, the tornado tore one more time at the shore on the opposite side of the lake, and Brian could hear trees being ripped down, and then it was gone. Gone as rapidly as it had come. It left nothing but Brian in the pitch dark. He could find nothing of where his fire had been, not a spark, nothing of his shelter, tools, or bed. Even the body of the fool bird was gone. I'm back to nothing, he thought, trying to find things in the dark, but to where I was when I crashed. Hurt, in the dark, just the same. As if to emphasize his thoughts, the mosquitoes, with the fire gone and protective smoke no longer saving him, came back in thick, nostril-clogging swarms. All that was left was the hatchet at his belt, still there. But now it began to rain, and in the downpour, he could never find anything dry enough to get a fire going. And at last, he pulled his battered body back in under the overhang where his bed had been and wrapped his arms around his ribs. Sleep didn't come. Couldn't come with the insects ripping at him, so he lay the rest of the night slapping mosquitoes and chewing with his mind on the day. This morning he had been fat, well, almost fat and happy, sure of everything, with good weapons and food and the sun in his face and things looking good for the future. And inside of one day, just one day, he had been run over by a moose and a tornado, lost everything, and was back to square one, just like that. A flip of some giant coin, and he was the loser. But there is a difference now, he thought. There really is a difference. I might be hit, but I'm not done. When the light comes, I'll start to rebuild. I still have the hatchet, and that's all I had in the first place. Come on, he thought, baring his teeth in the darkness. Come on, is that the best you can do? Is that all you can hit me with, a moose and a tornado? Well, he thought, holding his ribs and smiling, then spitting mosquitoes out of his mouth. Well, that won't get the job done. That was the difference now. He had changed, and he was tough. I'm tough where it counts, tough in the head. In the end, right before dawn, a kind of cold snap came down. Something else new, this cold snap. And the mosquitoes settled back into the damp grass and under the leaves, and he could sleep or doze. And the last thought he had that morning as he closed his eyes was, I hope the tornado hit the moose. So if I think about this particular passage, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what else could happen to this kid? He's been in a plane crash. He's been lost in the Canadian mountains for 40-something odd days. That very day, he's been attacked by a moose and injured. And now there's a tornado that happens. So, but if I really want to focus on our end in mind, which is cause and effect relationships, and I think about this particular tornado. So the cause is the tornado. And then what has been the effect on Brian? Well, at this point, the effect is that he's lost everything but the hatchet. He's lost it all. The tornado has ripped the front of his lean-to away. It has taken his bed away. It's taken the fire away. It has taken all of his weapons away. So the cause being the tornado, and the effect is that all of the stuff is gone. He's starting back at scratch. Another thing, or another effect, is that the tornado has thrown him around again. So the moose has already damaged his ribs and damaged his shoulder. And now the tornado is just kind of whipping him around again. So, but I want us to think about, you know, that's cause and effect. But what about this character trait again of Brian? You know, he says, I'm tough now. And that could be a character trait, that he's tough, that all of these 40-something days has taught him something about himself. The old Brian would have cried. The old Brian would have been like, oh, I can't do anything. But not the new Brian. The new Brian is thinking about, I got this. I still got my hatchet. I know what to do. I know how to rebuild my shelter. I know how to make new weapons. I know how to build fire. He is better than he was before. Now, when I think about Brian, I think about that he has more than just the hatchet. He now has all the knowledge that he's learned in those 40-something days. So yeah, he knows how to build fire. So he's going to be able to do it quickly now. He knows exactly what to do. He knows exactly how to build that shelter safely to keep the porcupine out. To be able to build it tight so that the skunk doesn't come in and try to get his food. He knows how to build the food shelf to keep things up high. So not only does he, it's not that he just has a hatchet, but now he has all of the knowledge that he's learned through this time. Now, this takes us to Team Talk. So, Team Talk Day 1. I want you breaking the questions down as I kind of read them over. In the past, we would normally just do 2 of these questions in class, and y'all know that. For the sake of time, we would do that. However, we've got a lot of time being off from school, so I'm going to have you do all 4 in your journal. And then the feed for tomorrow, or the link for tomorrow, I'm going to tell you how you need to sign in to Google Classroom, and then which questions you will upload for me to score and grade. And those will turn into daily grades, just like when we are doing them in class and I pull a stick and we're using our rubrics and scoring. I will be looking at those questions using that same rubric. And I had encouraged you all to bring your rubrics home with you so that when you're doing your questions, you've got that to look back at. Excuse me. Oh, it's been a long day for me too. So question 1, I want you breaking it down as we go. It says, how does Brian feel about the pilot? And what does Brian do? So that question kind of leaves us hanging. Is it a new pilot that shows up? And or is it the old pilot? So I want you to tell me how Brian feels about this pilot and in what does he subsequently do. Number 2, I want you to compare a serious injury to death for someone alone in the wilderness. And I want you to explain your answer. So it's not going to be good enough for you just to go in the book and find me some right there evidence. You're going to have to explain that evidence to me in your own words. Number 3, if this is a test question, it would be a 30-point answer. You would get 10 points for choosing the correct multiple choice. And then underneath your D, I want you to star it. It says explain your answer. So it wants you to pick out the best definition for the word sanity. And it says on page 157. However, you will find that word on page 152. So mark out 157 and write in 152. And then you're going to explain yourself. And last but not least, this is our end in mind classroom. Our end in mind question. You might want to go ahead and circle that number 4, because this one, without a shadow of a doubt, will go on to the Google Classroom site. It says, how does the tornado affect Brian in a positive way? I've just talked about some negative ways that this tornado and how it affected Brian. You know, the negative pieces. How it took away his weapons, how it tore away his fire and his bedding and all of those types of things. Those are negative ways that the tornado affected Brian. They're wanting you now to pick out one positive thing that the tornado has brought to Brian, and that's going to be your focus. So let's go ahead and pick our book back up. We are going to be on page 148. It says, when he awakened, the sun was cooking the inside of his mouth and had dried his tongue to leather. He had fallen into a deep sleep with his mouth open just at dawn, and it tasted as if he had been sucking on his food all night. Well, he rolled out and almost bellowed with pain from his ribs. They tightened in the night and seemed to pull at his chest when he moved. He slowed his movements and stood slowly, without stretching unduly, and went to the lake for a drink. So unduly is that excessively. So when he woke up, it's not like he decided to go, oh, stretch real big. Because if he had done that, the pull on those ribs would have been extremely painful. So unduly is excessively. He didn't stretch excessively and big. He probably just did like a little kind of slow stretch, really slight in motion, just to kind of make those muscles kind of relax. Let's go back to the story. At the shore, he kneeled carefully and with great gentleness and drank and rinsed his mouth. To his right, he saw that the fish pond was still there, although the willow gate was gone and there were no fish. They'll come back, he thought. As soon as I can make a spear or bow and get 1 or 2 for bait, they'll come back. He turned to look at his shelter and saw that some of the wood from the wall was scattered around the beach, but was still there. Then saw his bow jammed into a driftwood log, broken with the precious string still intact. Not so bad now, not so bad. And he looked down the shoreline for other parts of his wall, and that's when he saw it. Out in the lake, in the short part of the L, something curved and yellow was sticking 6 or 8 inches out of the water. It was a bright color, not an earth or natural color, and for a second, he could not place it. Then he knew it for what it was. Well, it's the tail of the plane, he said it aloud, half expecting to hear somebody answer him. There it was, sticking up out of the water. The tornado must have flipped the plane around somehow when it hit the lake, changed the position of the plane, and raised the tail. Well, he thought, well, just look at that. And at the same moment, a cutting thought hit him. He thought of the pilot still in the plane, and that brought a shiver and massive sadness that seemed to settle on him like a weight. And he thought that he should say or do something for the pilot, some words, but he didn't know any of the right words, the religious words. So he went down to the side of the water and looked at the plain and focused his mind, the way he did when he was hunting the fool birds and wanted to concentrate. He focused on the pilot and thought, have rest forever. Now, I didn't send sticky notes home with you all, and I regret that. In the mayhem of that Friday, I didn't get around to doing that. But what I would like you to do in lieu of sticky notes, since we don't have them, I want you to think back to what I just read and jot down beside the questions the page number and the paragraph that you want to refer back to when you get ready to answer the questions. So I'm going to give you just a few moments to do that. So I'd like you to go ahead and do that real quick. All right, so I'm hoping you were able to make some kind of quick note there. We're going to be on chapter 17 at this point. We just have about 2.5 more pages to read, and then that'll conclude this lesson. So chapter 17. He turned back to his campsite and looked to the wreckage. He had a lot to do. Rebuild his shelter, get a new fire going, find some wood, or get ready to find some food, make weapons. Then he had to work slowly because his ribs hurt. First things first, he tried to find some dry grass and twigs and then peeled bark from a nearby birch to shred into a fire nest. He worked slowly, but even so, with his new skill, he had a fire going in less than an hour. The flames cut the cool, damp morning, crackled, and did much to bring his spirits up, not to mention chasing away the incessant mosquitoes. There's that word, incessant, that constant. Now, if you remember back to the first part of our story, when he originally, or his initial days after the wreckage, the mosquitoes just ate him alive. And he talked about the buzzing and how they were all over him in the early mornings of pre-dawn and of that dusk. So incessant is constant. There was a constant flow of those mosquitoes just trying to eat him up. Let's get back to our story. He had great difficulty breaking them. Wrong place. 150. With the fire going, he searched for dry wood. The rain had driven water into virtually all the wood he could find, and at last located some in a thick evergreen where the top branches had covered the lower dead ones, keeping them dry. He had great difficulty breaking them, not being able to pull much with his arm or chest muscles, but finally got enough to keep the fire going all day and into the night. With that, he rested a bit, eased his chest, and then set about getting a shelter squared away. Much of the wood from his original wall was still nearby, and up in back of the ridge, he actually found a major section of the weave still intact. The wind had torn it down, lifted it and thrown it to the top of the ridge, and Brian felt lucky once more that he had not been killed or seriously injured, which would have been the same, he thought. If he couldn't hunt, he would die, and if he were injured badly, he would not be able to hunt. Well, he jerked and dragged wood around until the wall was once more in place, crudely, but he can improve it later. He had no trouble finding enough pine boughs to make a new bed. The storm had torn the forest to pieces. Up in back of the ridge, it looked like a giant had become angry and used some kind of massive meat grinder on the trees. Huge pines were twisted and snapped off and blown sideways. The ground was so littered with limbs and treetops sticking every which way that it was hard to get through. He pulled enough thick limbs in for a bed, green and spicy with the new broken sap smell. And by evening, he was exhausted, hungry, and hurting. but he had something close to a place to live again, a place to be. Tomorrow, he thought, as he lay back in the darkness, tomorrow maybe the fish would be back, and he would make a spear and new bow and get some food. Tomorrow he would find food and refine the camp and bring things back to sanity with the one completely insane day. He faced the fire. Curbing his body, he rested his head on his arm and began to sleep when a picture came into his head. The tail of the plane sticking out of the water. There it was, the tail sticking up. And inside the plane, near the tail somewhere, was the survival pack. It must have survived the crash because the plane's main body was still intact. That was the picture, the tail sticking up and the survival pack inside. Right there in his mind as he dozed. His eyes snapped open. If I could get at the pack, he thought. Oh, if I could get at the pack. It probably had food and knives and matches. It might have a sleeping bag. It might have fishing gear. Oh, it must have so many wonderful things. If I could get at the pack and just get some of those things, I would be rich. So rich if I could get at the pack. Tomorrow. He watched the flames and smiled. Tomorrow I'll see. All things come tomorrow. He slept deep and down, with only the picture of the plane tail sticking up in his mind. A healing sleep. So that ends our readings for this day 1. And I want you to be working on those questions. Those are what's going to be assigned tomorrow. You might want to start working on them now while the reading is fresh. Or you can save them for tomorrow. But what I will tell you is that in your tomorrow lesson, I will be looking for at least question 4 posted, and there will be at least one more that I requested. So keep that in mind, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.